I grew up in a small town in West Virginia and went to a small university about 15 minutes from home. I won't name the school, but in 2019, my freshman year, CO still shaped everything about campus life. The dorms especially felt hollow. Most students chose to rent nearby apartments instead of living on campus. I didn't have that option. Money was tight, so I stayed in the dorms and went home on weekends, convincing myself I could still get the real college experience. The dorms were eerily quiet, with long empty hallways stretching under flickering fluorescent lights. Doors were closed on both sides, and shadows pooled in the corners, giving the space a hollow, abandoned feel. Before move-in, my roommate and I exchanged a few texts after the school shared our numbers, which already felt a little invasive. She messaged first and seemed pleasant enough. In person, she was polite but distant, carrying herself with an air of quiet entitlement. At one point, she casually said, "Everyone gets their own room because there aren't many students. I did last semester, until you moved in." The comment caught me off guard, and instead of responding, I shifted the conversation. I told her I lived nearby and would leave Friday nights and return Monday mornings around 60 OZM. During the week, she barely spoke to me and usually stayed with her boyfriend in his dorm. Then things got strange. That first Friday, I packed up and left as usual. When I returned early Monday morning, exhausted and half asleep, I crawled back into bed since class wasn't until 100. About 10 minutes later, I felt the edge of my memory foam mattress slowly sink. I didn't move, too tired, too confused. After a moment, the pressure lifted. Realization hit hard. Someone had leaned on my bed. I turned and saw my roommate facing the wall, apparently asleep. I brushed it off and slept. The next weekend, the same routine. Same return time. Same need for rest. But this time, after lying down, the mattress dipped deeply. Not just the edge, the entire side sagged. Someone was sitting beside me. I stayed completely still, heart racing, frozen in the dark. Then I heard movement. My bed was unusually high, so high that I needed a step stool just to climb onto it. I clearly heard someone hop down from it. I held my breath, heart pounding, and slowly looked over. She was back in her bed facing the wall, exactly like before. I lay there staring, my mind scrambling for explanations. Was I hallucinating from exhaustion? Some kind of sleep paralysis? That didn't make sense. I could still move. Had someone broken into our room? That was impossible. We were the only ones with keys. Eventually, I convinced myself I was just beyond tired, my brain filling in gaps that weren't real. So I forced myself to sleep. When Monday came, anxiety sat heavy in my chest. I walked into the room and saw her already there, lying down and facing my bed, apparently asleep. It was still early in 2019, and campus felt quiet and tense. I climbed into bed and tried to rest. 5 minutes later, the mattress sank again. I squeezed my eyes shut as someone sat beside me. I told myself I'd turn around any second now, when I suddenly felt a hand rest on the back of my neck. My heart dropped. I thought I might pass out. I didn't move. The hand didn't tighten or hurt me. It just stayed there, heavy and deliberate. Time stretched endlessly. When the pressure finally lifted and the bed rose back up, I stayed frozen, too scared to breathe. After a few moments, I turned around. She was facing the wall, asleep. I didn't wait. I grabbed my things, left the room immediately, and called my mom. I skipped class that day. I told her everything, and she contacted the school. Thankfully, they allowed me to change rooms. They asked if I wanted to involve the police, but I said no, there was no concrete proof. I only asked one thing, that she never be given another roommate. After settling into my new room, pieces of the past started clicking into place. I remembered her casually mentioning that she'd had a previous roommate who didn't last very long, though she never explained why. At the time, I hadn't questioned it. Another memory surfaced too. One afternoon when she opened a locked drawer and I saw nearly 10 bottles of prescription medication inside. She brushed it off, saying it was for a skin condition. I had accepted that explanation back then, but now I wasn't so sure. I started wondering if she was dealing with something more serious, or if the medication came with disturbing side effects. A few days later, I realized I'd accidentally left a book and a binder in her room. I didn't care much about the book, but she messaged me insisting I come get it. I told her I was trying to focus on school in my new room, but agreed to retrieve my things so I wouldn't seem suspicious. My key still worked, so I let myself in. She wasn't there, and I felt a wave of relief. I grabbed my belongings and turned to leave, only to find her standing silently in the doorway. I hadn't heard the lock or her footsteps. I forced a smile, trying to stay composed. She said nothing as I moved to pass her. Then she asked, "Where's your new room?" I told her it was on the first floor. She asked which hall. I lied. She kept probing near the stairs, the front entrance, the office. I said I couldn't remember, but she didn't stop. I finally lied again and said it was near the stairs, then turned and walked out. I never saw her again. I hurried down the long, empty dorm hallway, exit sign glowing red at the far end. Shadows stretched along the floor as I pulled my backpack and binder, moving as quickly as possible toward freedom. I considered telling her boyfriend, but fear stopped me. Even now, years later in 2019, I still replay it in my mind. Was I dreaming? Hallucinating? I don't think so. It couldn't have been anyone else. We were the only ones with keys. Maybe she was sleepwalking from her medication. Or maybe she was planning something far darker. My mom believed she was testing how close she could get before I woke up. And that one morning, she may have actually tried to hurt me. I don't know the truth. All I know is that it's over now, and I sincerely hope she was never given another roommate. My name is Annabelle. I'm 20 years old from the UK, and what I'm about to share happened back when I was in high school, what we call college here, when I was just 16. To this day, it remains the most terrifying day of my life. I know that sounds dramatic, but trust me, there's a reason it still sticks with me. For some context, my school used lanyards with ID cards attached. Anyone could technically walk into the building, but to get past the foyer you had to scan your ID on a screen to unlock the doors. Each card had your name and photo, though most students flipped them around so their picture wasn't visible. That same ID was needed to open nearly every door in the school, except classroom doors. The building itself was fairly new, small in student numbers, but deceptively large in structure. 1/3 of it was a special school for students with learning disabilities, another third was a nursery, and the remaining section was the high school. I had only just started there, and on the very first day, we were all repeatedly warned never to let anyone inside the school, unless we knew them. The incident happened during the second week of term, but it was only my second full day in, because I'd been sick most of the week. I had geography for most of the day, and this took place around halfway through, about 20 minutes after lunch. At lunch, I downed an absurd amount of juice from the cafeteria, because we're not allowed to take drinks into class, and I had nowhere to put it without it spilling. 20 minutes later, it hit me. I desperately needed the bathroom. I asked my teacher if I could go, even though we're usually not allowed out during lessons. He was clearly annoyed since we'd only just had lunch break, but he could tell I wasn't exaggerating and finally let me go. That detail matters, because at that time, hardly anyone should have been walking around the school. I left the classroom, passed through a set of double doors into the cafeteria, which was completely empty, and continued into another large area with more classrooms. I used the bathroom, then headed back the same way. But when I pushed back through the doors into the cafeteria, I noticed a man sitting alone at one of the tables. At first, it didn't immediately seem strange. People aren't supposed to be wandering around during lessons, but like me, sometimes they do. I didn't know who the man was sitting there. He looked far too old to be a student, so I assumed he must be a teacher or maybe a parent, and I kept walking. Then he spoke. Hey, I let out a squeal because I'm naturally jumpy and froze. My face immediately burned with embarrassment, but he laughed softly and said, "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you." That's when I noticed he actually had a lanyard on. At the time, I assumed he was a teacher, but looking back, I realized there was something off. Even though his ID was hanging around his neck, the ID portion was flipped over, so his face and name were hidden on the back of the card holder. Students did this all the time, and scanners still worked, but for a teacher, it was definitely unusual. I didn't think much of it at the moment. Then he said, "I need some help getting some work things out of my car. Mind coming with me for a sec?" Without hesitation, I agreed, because I truly thought he was a teacher. We walked out of the cafeteria in silence, through the foyer, and out of the building. That's when I started noticing odd things. He seemed unusually nervous. Most teachers make small talk when walking with a student, but he said nothing. Instead, he fidgeted constantly, moving his hands from his pockets to holding them together, back and forth. I'm naturally shy, so I didn't try to break the silence either. By the time we left the building, the layout of the front of the school became clear. There's about 50 meters, roughly 55 yards, before the car park, which you can't even see until you're right next to it, because a wall of bushes blocks the view. Walk straight without turning into the lot, and you'd end up off school property. At that moment, It hit me just how isolated we were. We walked toward the car park without saying a word, the silence thick and uncomfortable, when he suddenly spoke. "Yeah, my work stuff's in the boot," he said, "what we call the trunk here in the UK. He added that he had a few bags and just needed help carrying some of them back inside. I told him that was fine, still fully believing he was a teacher. When we reached the car park, he pointed ahead and said, "My car's the blue one at the end." As we got closer, just a few meters away, I noticed something off, movement in the back seat. At first it didn't register, but with each step closer, my stomach dropped. There were at least 2 men crouched and hiding inside the car. I completely froze. Instead of running, my mind went blank. They must have realized I'd seen them, because the back door suddenly flew open. One man started scrambling out, and at the same time, the man I thought was a teacher grabbed my arm as I turned to run. He was tall and solid, and I'm only 5'2" and underweight, so I still don't know how I did it. Pure adrenaline, I guess. I ripped my arm out of his grip and sprinted back toward the school as fast as I could. I could hear multiple heavy footsteps pounding behind me. Thankfully, they stopped chasing me fairly quickly. My school had large glass automatic doors, the kind you have to wait for, and they would have caught me easily if they'd kept running. I think the glass made it too risky for them if someone saw. I burst into the foyer, ran straight into the open cafe connected to the library, and rushed to the woman working there, barely able to speak as I explained what had just happened. She calmed me down, stayed with me, and took me to a teacher's office where my parents and the police were called. There were security cameras in the car park, so the men were identified and charged with attempted kidnapping. It later came out that the man had gotten into the building using a lanyard a student had dropped outside, which is why the ID was flipped around. I didn't return to school for a couple of weeks, and I'm still in therapy because of this. Writing it all out and sharing it helps me process what happened. But even now, this remains the most terrifying experience of my life. The woman in the cafe stayed with me, holding me as I tried to calm down. The fear was still raw, but having someone there made a small difference. Later, the police reviewed security footage from the car park. The blue car was clearly visible, and the shadowy figures near it matched the men who had tried to grab me. Even now, I sit alone in my room, thinking about what happened, replaying it in my mind. Therapy helps, but the trauma lingers. Writing it all out and sharing it helps me process what happened. But even now, the school feels eerie in my memory, and this remains the most terrifying experience of my life. This incident took place while I was still at university. I studied at the University of Huddersfield from 2020 to 2021. The campus isn't exactly famous for its nightlife, so most evenings are eerily quiet, with students usually scattered between the library and a few academic buildings that stay open around the clock. I was never someone who enjoyed being out late, but during my final year, I didn't really have a choice. I was enrolled in an advanced statistics course, and the lecturer was infamous for assigning brutally heavy workloads. One of our largest projects was due, and I was already behind schedule. To make things worse, my laptop had been acting up for days, so I decided to rely on the desktop computers in the business building instead. That building sits slightly apart from the rest of campus, 3 stories high, aging, and unnervingly quiet, especially after dark. There was something about it that always felt cold and clinical. Still, the second-floor computer lab was usually deserted after 9:00 p.m., which made it perfect for uninterrupted work. I arrived there around 9:00 that night. The campus was completely silent, and the moment I stepped inside, I noticed the sharp drop in temperature. I swiped my student ID, heard the familiar beep, and the door clicked open. The air was thick with the smell of industrial cleaning chemicals, a clear sign that the cleaners had already finished and left the building. I headed straight to the lab, logged into a computer, and got to work. For a while, everything felt normal. The low hum of the machine and the steady tapping of keys were the only sounds keeping me company. I kept checking the clock on the screen, promising myself I'd leave before 50. Hosener then, around 11:30, something strange happened. As I scrolled through a dataset, a loud door slam echoed from somewhere deep in the hallway, not the main entrance, but further inside the building. I froze for a moment, then tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the ventilation system, or someone from maintenance. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. The cleaners had already been through hours ago. No one else should have been there. I shook it off and forced myself to keep working, even though the silence now felt heavier than before. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing down the hallway outside the lab. They weren't hurried, and they definitely weren't quiet. Whoever was out there sounded like they wanted their presence known. I went completely still in my chair, eyes locked on the glowing computer screen, silently hoping they'd keep moving. Instead, the footsteps stopped directly outside the lab door. There was a narrow window set into the door. I could have leaned back and looked through it, but fear glued me in place. I held my breath, barely blinking. After what felt like an eternity, maybe 10 seconds, the door handle started to rattle. Not a casual tug, not someone confused. It was aggressive, intentional, like they were testing how far they could push me without getting inside. My heart slammed against my chest. I knew the lab doors automatically locked late at night, so whoever it was shouldn't have been able to enter, but the persistence of it made my stomach twist. The handle kept shaking for another 30 seconds before suddenly stopping. Then the footsteps returned, slow and heavy, retreating down the hallway until the sound dissolved into silence. I sat there frozen, weighing whether I should grab my things and run. But my deadline was the next morning, and I kept telling myself it was probably just another student messing around. I forced myself to believe that and went back to typing. Less than 10 minutes later, I heard it again. Footsteps, but this time, they weren't in the hallway. They were coming from above me. The ceiling was made of thin panels, the kind that creak when pipes expand, but this was different. This was the unmistakable sound of movement, someone crawling or dragging themselves across the tiles overhead. I slowly looked up, dread flooding my chest. One of the ceiling panels shifted slightly, just enough to confirm that something was pressing its weight down from above. Then came a slow creak above me, like someone carefully lowering their weight, moving inch by inch to avoid making noise. That was it, I was done. I ripped my flash drive out of the computer, stuffed my notebook into my backpack, and shot up from the chair. The moment I stepped into the hallway, it felt like I'd crossed into another reality. The corridor was washed in dull, flickering fluorescent light, and the only sound was my own sneakers squealing against the tile floor. I moved quickly, forcing myself not to run, every nerve screaming. I reached the stairwell, shoved the door open, and started heading down. Halfway through, I made the mistake of glancing up. On the landing above me, just one floor higher, stood a man. He clearly wasn't a student or a professor. His clothes were loose, worn, and torn like they didn't belong on campus at all. Most of his face was swallowed by shadow, but I could see his mouth stretched open in what looked like an unnaturally wide grin. He didn't say a word. He didn't move. He just stared down at me. I didn't hesitate after that. I bolted, tearing down the stairs so fast I nearly fell. I burst through the first floor door and sprinted toward the front entrance. My ID barely scanned in time, but the second the lock clicked, I shoved the door open and ran across campus without daring to look back. I didn't stop until I was inside my dorm room, the door locked. My back pressed against it as I struggled to catch my breath. I returned the next morning only because I had no choice. I had to submit my project. In daylight, the business building felt completely normal, almost harmless. But then I noticed something that made my stomach sink. One of the ceiling tiles was missing, the one directly above where I'd been sitting, along with the tile in the corner I had seen shift. It suddenly made sense. Someone had been watching me from above, rattling the door on purpose to scare me. When they realized it was locked, they climbed back into the ceiling to get closer. I still don't want to imagine what might have happened if they'd made it inside before I ran. One thing's for sure, after that night, I bought a new laptop and decided all future assignments would be done safely from my dorm.